The blade was already at her throat before anyone in the hall had time to breathe. Elias Voss started laughing. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It wasn't the short choke sound a man makes when fear misfires and comes out wrong. It was low, quiet, the kind of laugh that belongs to someone who has just been proven right about something they had been waiting a very long time to see confirmed. Commander Rael, standing 6 feet to Elias's left, had gone completely still. Not still the way a soldier goes still when assessing. Still the way a statue is still. Limbs locked, eyes fixed, jaw set. The Dravari freeze response. Elias had read about it. 4 to 6 seconds of full-body paralysis when a direct threat presented itself to a superior. Evolution's way of keeping young soldiers from throwing themselves in front of their queen before they had processed the geometry of the situation. 4 to 6 seconds was longer than Elias needed. Senna, the interpreter, was pressed flat against the pillar to her right. Her hand was at her mouth. Under Dravari law, specifically the clause of Silent Hall, invoked the moment a ceremonial blade appeared in a treaty chamber. She could not speak, could not call out, could not intervene. The law had been written 800 years ago to prevent interpreters from being used as political weapons during negotiations. It had never anticipated a situation like this one. Nobody had. The hall was the grand receiving chamber of the Vileth Spire, the diplomatic seat of the Dravari sovereignty, carved into the upper atmosphere of a planet whose name Elias had spent 3 weeks learning to pronounce correctly. The ceiling was 60 meters of pale stone, shot through with veins of bioluminescent mineral that pulsed slowly, like breathing. The floor was polished obsidian. The air was 4 degrees colder than what Elias considered comfortable, and smelled faintly of something between ozone and rain. There were 43 people in the room. Elias had counted them when he walked in. He had noted where each one stood. He had noted which ones were armed, which ones had been armed, and had set their weapons in the ceremonial rack by the door, as the treaty protocol required, and which ones he suspected were armed with something that wouldn't show on a scan. Corin had been the third category. Elias had known that the moment he shook the man's hand. The greeting was formal. Right hand extended, fingers spread, a Dravari gesture of openness that demonstrated the palm carried nothing. Elias had returned it correctly, had held eye contact the appropriate duration, had not smiled because smiling was a threat display in Dravari culture, and he had learned that in his second week of preparation. While his eyes held Corin's, his peripheral attention had gone to the man's left wrist. The tendons there were wrong, not wrong as in injured, wrong as in load-bearing, the specific microtension of a forearm that has spent years accommodating the weight of something strapped along the ulna, hidden under a sleeve, held in place by a brace so thin it wouldn't disturb the drape of formal court robes. Elias had said nothing. He had filed it, the way you file the location of a fire exit when you enter a building. Not because you expect to need it, but because the cost of filing it is zero, and the cost of not having filed it could be everything. That had been 40 minutes ago. Queen Valeth had not moved. This was either composure or shock, and Elias, watching her from across the hall, was already deciding it was composure. She was standing exactly as she had been standing before the blade appeared. Weight centered, chin level, both hands at her sides in the open palm resting position of the Dravari ruling class. The blade was at the left side of her throat, pressed flat enough to be felt, but not yet cutting. Corin's arm was extended from behind her right shoulder, his body angled to put her between himself and the room. He was a large man by Dravari standards. Not as large as Elias had been expecting. The briefing files on Corin, former Supreme Marshal of the Dravari 7th Armada, had described someone who commanded rooms by mass alone. What the files had not captured was how he moved. Precise, economical. A man who had spent decades understanding that efficiency was more frightening than spectacle. He was afraid. Elias could see it. Not in his hands when his hands were controlled, but in the angle of his shoulders, which were 3 degrees too high. A man braced for impact he was trying not to show he expected. "This treaty," Corin said, and his voice carried through the frozen hall with the flatness of a man who had rehearsed this, "ends here." No one spoke. No one moved. The 41 people who were not Elias or Corin were doing what people do when violence appears without warning in a place where violence is supposed to be impossible. They were waiting for someone else to understand it first. Elias stopped laughing, not because the situation had stopped being what he'd expected, but because laughing was no longer the most useful thing he could be doing. He began walking toward Corin, not running, walking. The same pace he used when crossing the hall to refill his water during a recess, unhurried, directional, with the slightly bored quality of someone performing a routine task. His hands were at his sides. He did not reach for the sidearm at his hip, which was the only weapon he had been permitted to keep in the hall under the single guard exemption granted to Valeth's human security attachment. The exemption that every Dravari in this room had spent the last 6 months treating as a diplomatic formality rather than a practical reality. Rael unfroze. 4 seconds. Right on the model's prediction. Human! Rael's voice came out wrong, tightened by the residue of the paralysis reflex. Stand down. This is a Dravari internal... I heard you, Elias said. He didn't look at Rael. He was watching Corin's left wrist. The protocol for political violence within Sovereign... I heard you the first time, Commander. He kept walking. Corin's eyes had found him. There was calculation in them. The rapid threat assessment of a military man encountering an unexpected variable. His gaze moved across Elias in the way a person inventories a room. Height, weight, weapon, distance, speed. What Elias watched Corin conclude, in the second and a half it took to complete that assessment, was visible in the slight relaxation of the man's upper arm. The blade angle didn't change, but the tension behind it did. Elias was 5 feet 11, weighed 183 pounds, was wearing a formal diplomatic suit jacket that did not suggest musculature, was walking at a pace that did not suggest urgency, was unarmed to all appearances in the way that mattered, in the way that the 43-person briefing on human military limitations that Corin had certainly received would have prepared him for. Humans are physically comparable to a mid-development Dravari juvenile. Their skeletal density is lower. Their pain tolerance, while reportedly higher than expected, has not been tested under field conditions against trained Dravari combatants. Their reaction speed is adequate but not remarkable. The single guard exemption was granted as a courtesy. Do not treat the human attachment as a tactical consideration. Elias had read this assessment. A copy had been included in his own file, forwarded by the Dravari Diplomatic Office as part of the Mutual Transparency Protocol, an act they had almost certainly intended as bureaucratic thoroughness, and which Elias had received as useful information about what Corin believed. He stopped 4 feet from Corin. This was inside the range where a Dravari combatant expected a human to stop. The expected stopping point, based on what Corin knew about human threat responses, was 8 to 10 feet. Close enough to look involved, far enough to be safe. 4 feet was not that. 4 feet was where the calculation changed. Corin's arm tightened slightly against Valeth's throat. Another step and she... I'm not going to take another step, Elias said. I'm going to stand here. He looked at Corin, not at the blade, not at Valeth, at Corin's face and specifically at the point slightly above and between Corin's eyes. The focus point that Dravari combat psychology identified as the gaze location of an opponent who has already decided the outcome and is waiting for you to figure it out. Elias had practiced this in a mirror for 2 weeks. Corin's shoulders moved, just slightly, just enough. You find this amusing, Corin said. It wasn't a question. He had seen the laugh. He didn't understand it. And a man like Corin, a man whose entire career had been built on reading rooms, would not be comfortable not understanding something. A little, Elias said. You're going to explain that. No, Elias said. I'm not. Across the hall, Senna's hand had not left her mouth. Her eyes were moving between Elias and the doorway behind which, Elias knew, the Dravari High Council was currently in session, voting per the schedule on the final ratification motion that would make the treaty permanent. A vote that had been expected to pass by a margin of 2 seats, a vote that Corin, as a council member, had absented himself from in order to be here, which meant Corin was not here to stop the treaty through the blade. He was here because the vote was already going to fail. And this, the blade, the hall, the frozen room, was the announcement. Elias had worked this out 11 minutes ago, standing in his position at the east wall, watching Corin's face when the message came through Senna's earpiece, and she had gone very carefully, very deliberately neutral. He'd had 11 minutes to decide what to do about it. He had decided to wait. To let Corin make the move Corin had already committed to making, because a man who had already committed to a move could not change the geometry of it, and geometry was the only thing Elias actually needed. He'd had 11 minutes to find the right spot on the floor to stand on. He was standing on it now. Last chance, Corin said. The blade pressed slightly tighter. Valeth's chin rose by half a centimeter, not pulling away, keeping her airway clear. Elias noticed this and filed it. Walk away, human. This is not your war. Elias looked at the blade, looked at Corin's wrist, the left one, where the secondary weapon was still strapped, where the tendons were still wrong, where the micro-tension of a man about to transition from restraint to action had been building for the last 40 seconds. He looked back at Corin's face. No, he said. It isn't. He moved. He moved left, not toward the blade. Left, a lateral step, sharp and low, that took him out of Corin's direct sight line and put him at the angle where the secondary weapon on the left wrist had the worst possible draw arc. Corin's body rotated to track him. The rotation was automatic, the trained response of a combatant keeping a threat in front, and it pulled Valeth 3 inches in the same direction, which opened a 4-inch gap between her right shoulder and Corin's chest. Elias didn't take it. Not yet. He had moved to make Corin move, not to act, not yet. 90 seconds earlier, while Corin's blade was still hidden and the hall was still a hall, Elias had been standing at the east wall doing what he had been doing for 6 months. Being invisible, this was not difficult. The Dravari diplomatic staff had made it easy by treating him as furniture from the first day he arrived. The single guard exemption was the result of a treaty subclause inserted by the Earth Defense Force's legal division as a face-saving measure. After the Dravari Negotiating Committee had flatly refused to allow a human security team of more than one person inside their sovereign ceremonial spaces. The logic, explained to Elias in a briefing that had lasted 4 hours and included 17 slides, was that one human guard was a symbol. One human guard said, "We trust you enough to only bring one." One human guard was the kind of diplomatic gesture that made agreements possible. What it meant in practice was that Elias had been standing in ceremonial halls and conference chambers for 6 months, mostly alone, while the Dravari security apparatus around him operated as though he were a piece of equipment that had been placed there by mistake and that someone would eventually collect. Commander Rail had spoken to him directly on 4 occasions. 3 of those occasions were to inform Elias that he was standing in the wrong position. Once was to inform him that the refreshment table was for diplomatic staff, not security attachments. Senna had spoken to him more. Senna was different. A Dravari who had spent 11 years on human stations and who had developed the disconcerting habit of treating humans as though they were people. She had taught him the claws of Silent Hall. She had answered, without visible judgment, his questions about Dravari neuroanatomy. She had told him, in the 3rd month, that some of the guards had a nickname for him, Seth, which translated roughly as the small one who stands in corners. She had said this with an apology in her voice. He had thanked her. He had also, that same evening, written a 4-page addendum to his field notes on Dravari combatant physiology, which he had been compiling since month 1. The addendum was titled Reaction Time Variations Under Different Threat Stimuli, and it included a subsection on what happened to Dravari combatants' lateral movement speed when they were responding to a perceived low-threat target. Low-threat targets, the research suggested, were tracked with the dominant eye leading. This created a predictable drift in the combatant's guard angle, a half-second window during which the non-dominant side was open. Half a second was longer than Elias needed. He had tested this in the training room at 3 in the morning, alone with a dummy rig to approximate Dravari mass and a timer. He'd gotten it down to 0.3. The secondary weapon cleared Corin's sleeve. Elias had been watching for the forearm rotation that preceded the draw. A clockwise twist, small, the kind that breaks the magnetic seal on a wrist-mounted blade. He saw it start. He was already moving when the blade caught the bioluminescent light from the ceiling. He caught Corin's wrist with both hands, not grabbing, not blocking, but redirecting, feeding the draw's own momentum in a direction Corin's shoulder joint hadn't been expecting. The wrist blade passed 6 inches to Elias's left. His right hand kept hold of the wrist. His left found the pressure point on the underside of Corin's forearm, the one where the median nerve ran closest to the surface in Dravari anatomy, in the spot that human anatomy kept deeper and better protected. The spot Senna had confirmed was real, and that Elias had spent 2 weeks learning to locate by touch on a synthetic model. He pressed. Corin's hand spasmed. The wrist blade dropped. It hit the obsidian floor with a sound that rang through the frozen hall like a bell. Corin moved, fast. Faster than the briefing files had suggested, which Elias noted with the distant recording part of his brain, because it mattered for the next 30 seconds. He broke the wrist grip with a rotational force that Elias couldn't hold and shoved. A full-body shove, Dravari mass behind it, the kind that should have sent Elias into the wall. Elias moved with it, didn't brace. Moved with it, converting the shove's energy into lateral momentum, letting himself be pushed, but choosing the direction. He hit the pillar to his left with his shoulder instead of his back, which hurt less and left him facing the room instead of the stone. The primary blade was still at Valeth's throat. Corin had kept it. Whatever else happened, whatever Elias did, Corin had kept the primary blade in contact with the queen's skin. Elias felt the shoulder impact. It would bruise badly. He noted it, set it aside. Across the hall, Rael had unfrozen and was now doing exactly what Elias had known Rael would do, calculating. Rael was an excellent commander by every measure in his file. He was also a commander who had been trained in a military tradition where do not escalate a hostage situation was doctrine. Because Dravari combatants, with their freeze response, posed a real risk of triggering a second paralysis event if they acted too quickly, and a second paralysis event with a hostile holding a blade was categorically unacceptable. So Rael was frozen again, not by biology this time, but by doctrine, and he would stay frozen until one of two things happened. The hostage was clear, or someone else acted. Elias was someone else. Senna had not moved from her pillar. Under the claws of Silent Hall, she couldn't. But her eyes had found Elias's, and in them he read something he hadn't expected to need. Something that wasn't pity and wasn't fear, but looked more like the specific focus of a person who is watching someone attempt something that they understand is more calculated than it appears. She knew, he realized, not everything, but enough. The questions he'd asked, the things he'd been studying. She had put it together. He hoped that meant she wasn't going to try to stop him, because he was about to do something that was going to look, to every Dravari in this room, like a catastrophic failure of threat assessment. He pushed off the pillar and came at Corin directly. No feint, no angle. Straight line, fast, the most readable attack geometry imaginable. The kind that trained fighters countered by instinct before their conscious mind registered the decision. Corin countered it by instinct. The primary blade swung from Valeth's throat toward Elias. Valeth dropped, not falling, controlled, a deliberate downward movement that cleared the blade radius. And Elias noted this with the recording part of his brain and gave it a separate file. The queen had combat training. Of course she did. He'd need to factor that. The blade came at his left shoulder. He let it, not all of it. He turned, reducing the surface area, taking the cut across the meat of the shoulder rather than as the joint. It went deep enough to bleed freely, not deep enough to compromise the arm. He'd calculated this. He'd had 6 months to calculate this. He knew approximately what a Dravari blade would do at approximately this angle to approximately this part of his body, and he'd decided it was an acceptable cost for what it bought him. It bought him Corin's right hand, which was now committed, extended, in the follow-through of a strike that had landed, a position that felt like victory to the muscles that made it, which meant Corrin's body was in the process of translating landed strike into position of advantage, and that translation took time. Elias used the time. His right hand went to the side of Corrin's neck. Not the obvious target, not the throat. The side, below and behind the ear, where the Dravari main sympathetic ganglion cluster sat 6 millimeters below the skin. A cluster Elias had located in anatomy texts, confirmed with Senna's inadvertent answers, and spent 4 weeks learning to apply pressure to on a model. He applied pressure. Corrin's legs went unreliable. Not fully. Not a collapse. Not yet. Just a stagger, the involuntary shift of a body that has just had its central nervous system's traffic management briefly interrupted. He grabbed Elias's arm to stabilize himself, which put him in a grip he didn't intend to be in. Elias wrapped his left arm around the grip, his left arm, bleeding, which sent a very specific message to his nervous system that he heard and acknowledged and did not act on, in turn using Corrin's grip on him as the anchor, forcing Corrin's balance further off center. Corrin was bigger. Corrin was stronger. Corrin had won 37 documented hand-to-hand engagements in 31 years of military service. Corrin had also never, in 31 years, fought a human who had spent 3 years specifically studying how to fight a Dravari. They hit the floor. Elias on top, barely, his left arm screaming, his right hand trying to find the nerve cluster again. Corrin's free hand landing a blow to his ribs that felt like being hit with a stone post. Something cracked. Elias filed it under probably not critical and kept moving. The second door, the council chamber door, had opened. Elias saw it peripherally. 2 Dravari staff appeared in the frame, took in the scene and went still. Council staff, not security. They had come to deliver the vote result. He didn't have time to read their expressions. He was occupied. But the door being open meant the vote result was ready, and a ready vote result meant the council had reached a decision, and the decision would be delivered into this room within the next 60 seconds, whether the room was ready to receive it or not. 60 seconds. He needed to be done before the vote result arrived, because the vote result, whatever it was, would either make this easier or make it catastrophically complicated, and he didn't yet know which. He drove his elbow into the floor beside Corrin's head. Not a strike, a post, a pivot point, and levered himself into a position that made the nerve cluster accessible again. Corrin's hand found the side of Elias's face and pushed. Hard. The world tilted. Elias tasted blood where his teeth had found his cheek. He found the cluster. Pressed. Corrin's body went very still in the particular way of a system that has been told by a higher authority to stop sending conflicting signals. 30 seconds. That was what the model predicted. 30 seconds of full-body motor disruption before the Dravari nervous system rerouted. Elias had 30 seconds and a bleeding shoulder, and at least one cracked rib, and the full attention of 41 people who did not understand what they were looking at. He got up, stood, planted his feet on the spot he'd chosen. He looked at Commander Rail. "She's clear," he said. His voice came out level. He was mildly surprised by this. "Now would be a good time." Rail moved. 4 Dravari royal guards crossed the hall in 3 seconds and had Corrin's arms pinned before his nervous system began rerouting. Elias had timed it well enough that the window lined up cleanly. Corrin did not resist. The motor disruption had left him functional but not fluid, which was exactly the difference between a man who could fight and a man who could be managed. Elias stepped back, once, found the pillar and put his right hand on it, not leaning, just orienting. His left shoulder was bleeding through his jacket. He could feel it running down the inside of his sleeve, finding the crease of his elbow, dripping from his fingers with a rhythm that would eventually become a problem. Not yet. The cut was long but not deep enough to worry about for another 15 to 20 minutes. He had done the math on this beforehand as well, which he recognized was the kind of thing that required a certain cast of mind and which he had stopped questioning about himself somewhere in year 2 of this assignment. He looked at Queen Valeth. She was standing where she had dropped to. Not on the floor. She'd caught herself on one knee, a controlled descent, and she was in the process of rising. She straightened. smoothed the front of her ceremonial robe, a slow, deliberate gesture, the Dravari equivalent of "I am fine," and the fact that I am telling you I am fine by refusing to acknowledge that I might not be, is itself the proof. Her left hand went to her throat. She pressed two fingers lightly below her jaw, taking her own pulse the way a physician would. Her expression did not change. She looked at Corin, now held by four guards, beginning to find his coordination again. Then she looked at Elias. He met her eyes, did not look away, did not offer an explanation. He had learned in 6 months that Valeth asked questions with her silence and gave answers with her silences, and that talking into those silences was the single most reliable way to make her stop listening. So he was quiet. Her gaze moved to his shoulder, his arm, his hand, where the blood had reached his fingers and was now making slow, dark shapes on the obsidian floor. She watched this for a moment with an expression that Elias couldn't yet read. It wasn't quite concern, and it wasn't quite assessment, and it was something in between that he didn't have a Dravari cultural reference for. Then the council chamber door opened fully, and everything got complicated. High Chancellor Loren walked in. He was old. Old by Dravari standards, which meant old by any standard. The skin of his face carrying the deep silver striations that appeared in Dravari elders, past 2 centuries of age. He walked with a staff and moved slowly and had eyes that processed a room the way a satellite processed terrain. Everything, simultaneously, without visible reaction. He took in Corin in the grip of the royal guard, took in the 2 blades on the floor, took in the blood, took in Elias. He stopped in the center of the hall. "The High Council," he said in Dravari, and Senna's voice came immediately and quietly from beside the pillar, translating for the record even though Elias didn't need it, "has reached a decision." Nobody spoke. "The ratification motion has failed." He held the pause the way a man holds a stone before setting it down. "By 2 votes. The hall processed this in different ways." Elias watched the room the way he always watched rooms, picking specific faces, specific reactions, filing them. 3 of the Dravari diplomatic staff closed their eyes briefly. 4 of the Earth Defense Force observers at the back of the room went very still in the way people go still when they are deciding whether to send an emergency transmission. Senna's hand found the pillar behind her, and her weight shifted onto it. Rael's expression did not change. But his eyes moved to Corin, and something in that glance told Elias that Rael had known. Maybe not the specifics, but the shape of it. Corin looked up from the guard's grip. His coordination was returning. Elias could see it in the quality of his neck muscles, the way his gaze was sharpening. He looked at Lorne. Then he looked at Valeth. "This is over," Corin said. His voice had recovered fully. "The people have spoken." "Whatever, Theater." His gaze went to Elias. "You arranged here is irrelevant. The treaty is dead." "The treaty," Valeth said, and it was the first time she had spoken since the blade appeared, and the hall went immediately and completely silent in the way of a space that had been waiting for that exact voice, "is not the only thing we are discussing." She walked toward Corin, not quickly, not slowly. With the specific pace of someone who has decided that distance is a formality and is dispensing with it. The guards held Corin. She stopped 3 feet from him. "You entered this hall under ceremonial covenant," she said. "You drew a blade inside the treaty chamber." She tilted her head fractionally. "I am curious what you imagined would follow." "Justice," Corin said. "The kind this council is too compromised to deliver." "Justice," she repeated, not mocking, considering. "And the human. What were you expecting from the human?" Corin's eyes went to Elias. The thing in them now was harder to name than what had been there before. Earlier it had been calculation. Now it was something between confusion and a kind of professional revision. The look of a man updating a model he had been confident in. "I expected him to do what humans do," Corin said. "Step back. Call for help. Wait." Valeth did not look at Elias. And instead, Corin said, and the word came out with the quality of something that cost him, he laughed. The hall had the specific quality of a space in which 40 people are trying very hard not to make noise. Rael stepped forward. He had the look of a commander reassembling his professional composure from components that had been briefly scattered. Your Majesty, you should be examined by the medical staff immediately. The security breach. In a moment, Valeth said. She was still looking at Corrin. The vote result. I heard the vote result, Commander. Rael went quiet. He was not accustomed to going quiet in these situations. Elias could see that. He noted it without satisfaction. One of the Earth Defense observers, Lieutenant Mara Osei, the one who had spent the most time during the summit trying to catch Elias's eye to exchange exhausted looks about the pace of Dravari bureaucratic process, had moved to the edge of the hall near the wall, and she was speaking into her comm unit quietly enough that Elias couldn't read the words. She was looking at him. He gave her a very small nod. I'm fine. Handle the transmission. She didn't look convinced, but she turned back to the comm. Elias was, on reflection, not entirely fine. The rib situation was clarifying. It was the kind of clarification that happened when adrenaline began to recede and the underlying physical reality started filing its reports. 2 ribs, he estimated. Maybe 1.5. The crack he'd heard had been singular, but the pain was distributed in a way that suggested a secondary stress fracture rather than a clean break. His shoulder was a problem that was going to become a more urgent problem in approximately 10 minutes. His left hand had developed a tremor that he was managing by keeping it slightly behind his hip, out of direct sight lines. He was upright. He was functional. He had the high-frequency alertness of someone running on the far side of their physical limits and had learned not to let this show on their face. Across the room, Senna had finally pushed off her pillar. The claws of Silent Hall dissolved when the active threat was secured. Corrin in the guard's grip qualified, and she was moving carefully through the space between people, making her way toward him. When she reached him, she stopped and looked at his shoulder with an expression that he recognized as the Dravari equivalent of poorly concealed alarm. You knew, she said quietly. Not a question. I knew some of it, he said equally quietly. The questions you asked me, the anatomy. She looked at Corrin, at the floor where the wrist blade had fallen. You were preparing for him specifically. I was preparing for the possibility of him specifically, Elias said. There's a difference. She considered this. How long? Since month 3, he said, when his name started appearing in the transmissions that weren't supposed to be intercepted. Her eyes came back to him quickly. Those transmissions were encrypted at the... I know, he said. I'm a good guesser. She stared at him for a moment. Then something happened to her expression that he had only seen happen to her face twice before. A kind of involuntary revision. The look of someone discovering that a map they trusted has a section marked unknown that is larger than the map suggested. Vayseth, she said, the small one who stands in corners. But the way she said it now was different. The same sounds carrying a different weight. He didn't respond to that. Lauren had not moved from the center of the hall. He was watching Valeth, who was watching Corrin, who was watching the floor with the expression of a man conducting an internal accounting he was not pleased with. The vote, Lauren said, can be called again, within the statutes. The statutes require a 60-day interval between failed ratification motions, one of the staff members said, from somewhere behind Elias. Then we have 60 days, Valeth said. She turned from Corrin. Turned at last to look at Elias directly. He had been waiting for this. He had known it was coming, and he had spent the preceding minutes deciding how to be looked at by her, which sounds like a small thing and was not. 6 months of being the piece of furniture that someone had placed there by mistake. 6 months of being Vayseth in every corridor, in every briefing room, in every formal hall. And now the room was rearranged, and he was in it differently, and she was looking at him with the eyes of a woman who was very good at seeing, and was seeing something she hadn't seen before, and was deciding what to do about it. He met her gaze, did not offer the thing she was trying to read, made her find it. You're bleeding, she said. Yes, he said. You took the cut intentionally. It wasn't a question. He answered it anyway. Yes. Why? Because the alternative, Elias said, was letting him keep both hands free for longer than I could afford. Valeth was quiet for 3 seconds. This was a long silence for her in a room full of people. He didn't fill it. You laughed, she said. At the beginning? Yes. Explain that. He considered it. Decided the truth was the cleanest answer. Because I'd been standing in the corner for 6 months, he said, waiting to find out if I'd gotten the geometry right. And when he pulled the blade, I found out I had. The hall was very quiet. Valeth looked at him, past the jacket, past the blood, past the version of him that the room had been operating with for 6 months. She looked at him the way she looked at the treaty documents before she signed them, as though she was reading something that had been in front of her for a while and that she had just understood was written in a language she hadn't been applying. Then Lauren's staff struck the floor once, the formal sound of a session being called, and the hall began the complicated process of becoming a room where an official accounting was going to happen. Elias's left-hand tremor got worse. He moved it further behind his hip. He had about 8 minutes before the shoulder became an argument he couldn't postpone. He planned to spend those 8 minutes standing exactly where he was. Corin looked up at him from the guard's grip. The revision in his eyes had completed. What was there now was the specific expression of a military man who has encountered a capability he did not account for and is updating his model to include it. Not afraid, not broken, just revised. The professional courtesy of one combatant toward another. Elias did not nod. He didn't acknowledge it. He looked at the door instead, because the medical team was going to come through it soon, and he needed to decide how much convincing they were going to require to let him stand here for another 8 minutes first. The door opened. He started the negotiation. Corin's knee hit the obsidian floor before the guards let go of his arms. Not because they forced it. Because Elias had pressed the ganglion cluster again. This time with 2 fingers, precisely, from across the distance Corin had not believed was enough for it to matter. And Corin's legs had simply stopped receiving the message to hold him up. That was how Chuang 4 opened for the 41 witnesses in the grand receiving chamber. Not with a speech, not with a declaration, not with the formal pronouncement of a senior officer. With a large decorated former Supreme Marshal of the Dravari 7th Armada going involuntarily to one knee in front of a human who was breathing raggedly on the obsidian floor, and who looked for all the world like he was doing something he had done before and found unremarkable. The sound Corin made was not a word. The sound the room made was not a sound at all. The medical team had come, and Elias had told them 4 minutes, and they had not been pleased, but they had accepted it in the way that people accept things from someone whose bleeding shoulder and level voice are occupying different categories of communication. The shoulder says this person needs attention now, and the voice says this person is not going to receive it for 4 minutes. And the 2 messages together create a cognitive short circuit that tends to resolve in favor of the voice. He had 4 minutes. He used one of them standing still, letting the room look at what it was looking at. Corin on one knee, not held there. The guards had stepped back when it happened, confused, reverting to positioning rather than constraint. Corin's hands were on the floor. His head was bent, not in submission, but in the involuntary forward posture of a body that is working very hard to maintain upright without full cooperation from the lower nervous system. Elias waited for Corin's head to come up. It took 11 seconds. When their eyes met, Elias spoke. "You have 31 documented hand-to-hand engagements," he said. His voice was even, not loud. The hall's acoustics did the rest. "I read all of them. Your preferred finish is a nerve cluster strike to the base of the skull. You've used it in 19 of the 31. You always set it up with a weight transfer to your right, which creates a drop in your left side guard that you've never had to worry about because every opponent you've faced has attacked your right." He paused. "I attacked your left." Corin said nothing. "The wrist blade, your files say it's been confiscated twice in diplomatic security sweeps and replaced twice within the same week both times, which told me you consider it non-optional equipment, not situational. Which told me you'd have it here regardless of the scan." He tilted his head a fraction. "The draw arc is limited to about 40 degrees of forward reach. I needed to be inside that arc when you used it. That's why I kept walking toward you." The hall was the kind of quiet that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of 40 people not making any. The laughing, Elias said. That was because the scan at the door flagged a ferrous density inconsistency on your left arm, and the security officer ran a secondary diagnostic instead of a manual check, which meant they found nothing, which meant I was the only person in this room who knew you were armed, which meant that for the last 40 minutes I was the only person in this room who knew what was coming. He stopped. And I had the geometry, so it was, briefly, funny. Corin looked at him for a long moment. You knew, he said, before I moved. Yes. You let me draw. Yes. The understanding moved across Corin's face slowly, the way light moves across a room at dawn. You don't see it start, you just notice that the room is different than it was. You needed me to draw, he said, because if I didn't draw, you had no legal standing to act. Under the clause of ceremonial restraint, Elias said, a security attachment is permitted to use preventive force only after a hostile action is initiated by the opposing party. If I'd acted on the wrist blade before you drew it, I would have assaulted an unarmed diplomat. He met Corin's eyes. I needed you to start it. Corin was quiet. You also needed, he said slowly, for Her Majesty to survive long enough for it to matter. Yes, Elias said, and she did. Because she has combat training and she knew to drop when the blade came off her throat, and because I was at an angle where my approach pulled your attention, and your primary blade, away from the optimal cutting position before she moved. Silence. You factored her response, Corin said, without asking her. I didn't need to ask her, Elias said. I've watched her for 6 months. She is not a person who needs to be told to survive. Something shifted in Corin's face. The revision was complete now. The model had updated all the way down, past the operational layer into whatever layer held his understanding of what a thing was. He was looking at Elias the way you look at a thing you have been wrong about for a long time, when the wrongness has just become visible and unignorable. You are, Corin said quietly. Nothing like the briefing. I know, Elias said. I read the briefing. High Chancellor Lawrence struck his staff against the floor. This session, he said, is formally convened. The incident of this hall will be entered into record. All parties will provide account. He looked at Elias. The human security attachment is requested to present his account first. Elias reached into his jacket with his right hand, moving slowly, clearly, the deliberate clarity of someone who is aware that any ambiguous motion in this room has a cost, and produced a folded document. He held it out. A staff member took it, unfolded it, brought it to Lorne. Lorne looked at it. His expression for the first time in the session moved. This is, Lorne said, a signal intercept report. Yes, Elias said, dated 11 weeks ago, showing communication between the identifiers I've cross-referenced in Appendix 2 with the council members who submitted the counter-ratification motion 3 days after that communication. Lorne looked up. Appendix 3, Elias continued, contains the scan anomaly report from today's security intake, the one that flagged the ferrous density on Commander Corin's left arm and was cleared by secondary diagnostic. I requested a copy of that report at 800 this morning on the grounds of my security attachment mandate. It was provided. He paused. It's time-stamped before the session began. The room was processing this. You had evidence, Rail said, from his position near the left column. His voice had a quality Elias hadn't heard in it before. Before any of this started, yes, you could have brought it to the council. I could have, Elias said. The council has a 48-hour review period before acting on externally sourced intelligence. Corin was planning to act today. Rail looked at the document in Lorne's hands, then at Elias. The thing in his expression was complicated. The specific complication of a man who is proud of a security apparatus that has just been demonstrably outperformed by a single person. He had handed 3 direct corrections about standing positions. He said nothing, which was, Elias thought, the correct choice. Loran read the document in full. His staff stood beside him, reading over his shoulder. 2 of them went to retrieve the appendices, which were in a secondary envelope that Elias produced from the same jacket pocket. While they read, Valeth moved. She crossed the hall to where Elias was standing. She stopped in front of him, closer than the formal distance, closer than the 6 months had ever placed her, the distance at which a conversation stops being official and becomes something else. She looked at his shoulder, his arm, his hand, which he had stopped hiding behind his hip because the tremor had gotten worse, and the hiding had become more conspicuous than the tremor. "The medical team," she said. 30 seconds, he said. "You said 4 minutes. "I've been more conservative with estimates than the situation warranted," he acknowledged. She looked at him. The expression on her face was the one he hadn't been able to read earlier, the one that wasn't concern and wasn't assessment. He was closer to it now. It was something he recognized, belatedly, as the expression of someone who has spent 6 months in the presence of something and has just understood what it was. "Why," she said, "are you here?" He understood she didn't mean the hall, didn't mean today. "Because someone had to be," he said. "Someone who would read 31 combat files," she said. "Someone who would spend 6 months in corners, learning things no one expected you to need. Someone who would take a blade to the shoulder on purpose because the geometry required it." She held his gaze. "Earth Defense Force sent many candidates. You were not the most decorated." "No," he said. "You requested this assignment." He hadn't known she knew that. He kept his face still. "Yes. Why?" He looked at her, at the hall, at the 40 people who were watching this conversation with varying degrees of discretion and failing at all of them. "Because I thought," he said, "that if someone was going to stand in the corner for a year and be the small one who waits, it should be someone who understood why the waiting mattered." Valeth was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she reached out and pressed 2 fingers lightly to his right hand. Not holding it, just the brief, precise pressure of a specific Dravari gesture that Elias had read about in month 2 and filed and not expected to ever have directed at him. The gesture that meant, in the formal language of Dravari court, "I see what you did." The seeing is the acknowledgement. He did not say anything. The medical team arrived at his elbow. He let them. The vote result from the High Council had failed by 2 votes. Those 2 votes, Lauren announced, while the medical team worked on Elias's shoulder in the corner of the hall, corresponded to 2 council members whose identifiers appeared in the intercept report. Both members were placed on formal suspension pending review. The treaty was not dead, it was delayed. The 60-day recess interval, Lauren said, would begin immediately. Corin, who had recovered full motor function and was now seated in the formal position of a person in custody, said nothing during this announcement. He looked at the floor. He looked once at the documents in Loren's hands. He looked at Elias. Not with hostility, Elias noted. With something that might, in another context, have been acknowledgement. The wrist blade was still on the floor. No one had picked it up yet. In the bioluminescent light of the ceiling, it made a thin silver line on the black stone. Like a sentence written in a language the room was still deciding how to read. Elias watched it from the corner, while the medic worked and thought that the next 60 days were going to be either very interesting or very boring. He was hoping for boring. He did not think he was going to get boring. 60 days later, the vote passed by 7, not 2. 7. The margin that Rael reported to Valeth in the corridor outside the council chamber at 3:40 in the morning, and that Valeth reported to no one because she walked directly from that corridor to the room where Elias was sitting with a field report and a cup of something the station kitchen produced that was approximately coffee if you didn't think about it too closely. She knocked. He said, "Come in." She sat down across from him without ceremony and said, 7. He put down the report. "That's more than I modeled." "You modeled it." "I modeled 2 scenarios. The evidence review adding 3 votes. The Corin proceedings adding another 2. I had 5 as the ceiling." She looked at him with the expression he'd been cataloging for 60 days. The one he now had a better name for, which was interested in the specific sense of a person who has found something that continues to produce new information and has decided to remain in proximity to it as a result. "The proceedings," she said, "added 4 votes, not 2. The testimony from the Armada officers," he said. "I didn't account for how many of them would speak voluntarily once the intercepts were entered as evidence." 22 came forward, she said. In the first week. I know, he said. I was surprised. Were you? By the number, he said, not by the phenomenon. When the cost of silence goes away, the people who were silent often aren't silent anymore. Valeth was quiet for a moment. Outside the room, the station had the low-frequency hum of a facility at 0340, air circulation, power systems, the specific vibration of something large doing its necessary work without anyone watching. Rail has submitted a formal request, she said, to reclassify the human security attachment mandate. Ilias looked up from the report. Currently, she said, the mandate limits the human attachment to a single individual. Rail is proposing a working group to review whether that limitation serves its stated purpose. What's the stated purpose? Symbolic confidence building between the two civilizations, she said. One human, to demonstrate trust. And Rail's position on whether it serves that purpose. Rail's position, she said, is documented as, the current mandate is structurally adequate but operationally outdated, and the events of the incident in the Grand Receiving Chamber suggest that its framing assumptions may warrant revision. Ilias was quiet for a moment. Rail wrote that. He did. Rail, who told me 4 times that I was standing in the wrong position. 3 times, she said. The 4th time was about the refreshment table. He looked at her. She was not smiling. Dravari didn't smile. The musculature wasn't built for it in the same way. But there was something in her eyes that occupied the same conceptual space as a smile, which he had also been cataloging. The working group, he said. What does it actually mean? It means, she said, that the assumption is being examined, whether one human was ever actually a symbol of trust, or whether it was a symbol of the belief that one human was not enough to worry about. She held his gaze. And whether those 2 things were the same assumption or different ones wearing the same clothes. He thought about that. Different, he said. Obviously. Obviously, she agreed. Now. In the Dravari High Council chamber, 2 chairs sat empty where they had not been empty before. 22 Armada officers had submitted testimony. The treaty document, delayed, amended, reviewed over 60 days of negotiation that had been conducted in a different key than the 6 months preceding them, at a lower pitch and a longer range, lay on the ratification table with 43 signatures on it. 43, the exact number of people who had been in the Grand Receiving Chamber the day a wrist blade fell on an obsidian floor and a human laughed. Lauren had noted this publicly. Elias suspected it was deliberate, the way Lauren's things tended to be deliberate. A man who understood that meaning was layered, and that sometimes the right layer to surface was the one that made the room remember what it had been present for. The treaty covered 7 areas of shared governance. The 4th area, which had been the most contested in the preceding 6 months, and which had come closest to collapsing the negotiations before the incident, was border security. The revised language, negotiated in the 43 days following the security review that had come out of the incident, included for the first time in any Dravari human accord, language that did not specify equivalent capability as the criterion for mutual security arrangements. It specified demonstrated effectiveness instead. This had been Rail's language. He had submitted it in writing on day 12 of the 60-day interval, via the formal amendment process, in a document that was 3 pages long and that Elias had read 4 times. The word human did not appear in the document. It didn't need to. Senna found him on the observation level of the Valeth Spire at Ors 600, when the light from the planet's star was beginning to come through the high atmospheric window, at the angle that made the bioluminescent veins in the stone pulse their brightest. She leaned against the rail beside him and looked at the planet's surface far below, the blue-gray of its oceans, the dark mass of its equatorial forests, the thin silver lines of its cities. "They're calling you Selcorvin now," she said. He looked at her. "I don't know that one." "It's not common," she said. "Old court language. It means—" She paused, choosing. "The one who waits knowing." She looked at the planet. "It's not an insult." "I know." "Vayseth was never really an insult either," she said. "It was just, they didn't know what they were looking at." He was quiet. "The questions you asked me," she said, "about the neuroanatomy, About the ganglion cluster. I answered them because I thought they were academic. She glanced at him. Were they ever academic? They were academic, he said, in the sense that I didn't know for certain I was going to need them. But you were preparing. I'm always preparing, he said, for things I hope I don't need. She considered this. Is that difficult? Always preparing for things you hope don't happen. He thought about the 3 years of field notes, the training room at 3 a.m., the mirror, the 31 combat files, the 11 minutes of standing still in the corner of a hall, knowing and waiting. It's not difficult, he said. It's just the job. She looked at him with the expression he'd seen twice before. The involuntary revision, the map with more unknown territory than expected. You requested this assignment, she said. He looked at her. Valeth told me, she said. Not the whole of it, just that. He turned back to the planet below. The star's light was fully through the window now, and the stone of the spire was doing the thing it did in full morning light. The bioluminescent veins going from pale pulse to something closer to fire, like the building itself was warming up. I read the initial contact reports, he said, from the first 3 years, the Dravari and humanity, before the negotiations started. He was quiet for a moment. Both sides had the same problem. Both sides thought the other one was a certain kind of thing, and the thing they thought the other one was, that was the war. Not the actual other side, just the idea of them. Senna didn't speak. Somebody was going to have to stand in a corner for a year, he said, and be wrong about and look like what people expected to look like, and wait. And I thought if that was the cost of getting the geometry right, he stopped. I don't think the cost was excessive. The star came fully over the atmospheric horizon, and the entire observation level went the color of something between gold and silver, which was not a color human architecture produced, and which Elias had not yet gotten used to and did not particularly want to. 22 Armada officers, Senna said. Yes, that surprised you. The number surprised me, but not the principle. No, he said. When the cost of silence goes away, they speak, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a while, then, Valeth asked me to tell you something. He waited. She said, the next time there is geometry to be calculated, I would prefer to be told in advance. Senna's tone was perfectly neutral. She specifically said, prefer, not require. I think the distinction is intentional. He thought about Valeth watching him bleed on an obsidian floor, pressing 2 fingers to his hand with the precision of someone who had decided something and was enacting the decision. Tell her, he said, that I'll take it under consideration. Senna looked at him. That's not an agreement. No, he said. She'll notice that. She notices everything, he said. That's why she's still alive. Senna was quiet for a moment. Then she made a sound, low, brief, that was the Dravari equivalent of a laugh, which Elias had heard from her a handful of times, and which always sounded like something caught by surprise. Sal Corvin, she said, the one who waits knowing. He looked at the planet. I heard you the first time, he said. The treaty signing was scheduled for 1,000 hours. Elias arrived at 0930 and took his position at the east wall of the grand receiving chamber. The obsidian floor had been cleaned. The 2 blades, primary and wrist-mounted, were gone, catalogued as evidence and now held in the formal archive of the High Council's record chamber. There was no visible trace of what had happened here 60 days ago, except in the people who had been here to see it, and what that event had done to the models they had been operating with. The hall filled. 43 people, the same 43, by design. Lauren had specified this. The treaty would be signed by the witnesses of the incident, which was either ceremonially meaningful or operationally symbolic or both, and which Elias thought was very probably the correct call. Rael arrived early. He walked across the hall to Elias's position at the east wall and stood beside him without speaking for a moment. Then he said, Your position is acceptable. Elias looked at him. For the record, Rael said, your position has been acceptable for approximately 58 of the past 60 days. What about the other 2? You were in medical, Rael said. The position was unoccupied. An unoccupied position is by definition not acceptable. He paused. Operationally, Elias said nothing. The working group, Rail said. On the mandate revision, I've submitted your field notes as reference material, the annotated anatomy files, the intercept cross-reference methodology. He looked at the hall, not at Elias. I want it on record that the submission is mine. The credit for the methodology is yours. Elias looked at him. Rail was still looking at the hall. Thank you, Commander, he said. Rail nodded once, formally. Then he returned to his position near the left column without further comment. Valeth entered at 0959. She walked the length of the hall with the pace of someone who has decided that distance is a formality and is dispensing with it, which was the pace she always used and which Elias had long since catalogued along with everything else. She wore the formal treaty robe, pale gray, floor length, the silver ceremonial markings of the Dravari sovereignty at the collar and cuffs. And she carried nothing, because Valeth, in formal setting, considered objects in hand to be a form of concealment, and concealment to be a form of weakness. She passed the east wall, past Elias. She did not stop. She did not look at him. But her right hand moved. Barely, just the fingers, just for a moment, in the specific gesture that meant, in the formal language of Dravari court, I see you. The seeing is the acknowledgement. He did not move, did not respond visibly. He filed it. In the space where he kept the things that were not operational and not analytical, and not part of any preparation for any future geometry. The space that had been almost empty for 3 years, and that was, quietly, less empty than it had been. The treaty signing began. The hall was full of the sound of formal proceedings and the low pulse of bioluminescent stone, and 43 people who had been in a room 60 days ago when something happened that none of them had expected, and that all of them were still, in different ways, revising their understanding of. Elias stood at the east wall. He waited. This time he knew what he was waiting for. I keep thinking about the 11 minutes. Not the fight, the 11 minutes before it, when he already knew and had to stand there and not show it. The wait is the hardest part, and nobody in that hall saw it because it didn't look like anything. Here's what I can't stop turning over. If one person had looked at him differently, actually looked, not just registered him as furniture, would any of it have gone differently? Or is it possible that being invisible was the whole point, and being seen too early would have cost him the geometry? If you've ever had to wait quietly for something to happen that you already knew was coming, I'd really like to hear what that was like for you, down in the comments.